Thank you all for coming back for our fantastic lineup of 2 panels this afternoon. I haven't had a chance to introduce myself yet, so I'll do so now. I'm Jill Begeiski. I'm the Executive Director for Academic Engagement and Research here, and it is a great honor to have everyone in this room with us today. Right now I'm going to introduce the moderator for the second panel. We are overjoyed to have Christine Frohnert with us today, who is a partner of Beck and Frohnert LLC, the Conservation of Contemporary Art, based in New York City since 2012. Previously, Christine Frohnert served for 12 years as a conservator of contemporary art and later as chief conservator at the Museum Ludwig in Cologne. She was chair of the American Institute for Conservation's Electronic Media Group from 2008 to 2012 and initiated the conference series called Tech Focus. Frohnert was named the inaugural Judith Paschke Distinguished Visiting Professor in Conservation and Technical Studies at the Conservation Center at New York University's Institute of Fine Arts in 2012. Following her appointment, she offered instruction in time-based media art, including courses on art with a plug, which is lovely. So Christine has been such an engine in getting this conversation rolling in New York City and worldwide. So it's a great honor to have her with us today. So I'm going to ask Christine to come to the podium and get us started on our second panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill, for the lovely introduction. It is such an honor and joy being here. And I have to say the energy that has been transported through the room this morning is highly, highly engaging. So welcome back to the next session, which is focusing on collecting and preserving the immaterial. And before I'm going to introduce our fantastic speakers of this session, I just wanted to say one word or a phrase that I picked up this morning when there was mention of, when we were talking about performative art and time-based media art, and somebody mentioned the score actually is the engine, which made me think of John Turngelly's Homage to New York. It's the self-destructing machine that performed its self-destruction within 28 minutes according to a precisely outlined score that was actually written on the back of a cigarette package that clearly described what should have happened when the 8 step relays kicked in to perform the self-destruction. And this made me think of a work that helps our conceptual framework to understand these work very much as performative works, but they're also mediated through technology. Plus, we are only left with the remains of the self-destructing event, which are the relics that still exist in physical form, the writings about this piece, as well as the film documentation that we have to understand clearly what happened on March 17 in the garden at the Museum of Modern Art. Speaking of the Museum of Modern Art, it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our first speaker in this panel. Kate Lewis is the Agnes Gunn Chief Conservator at the Museum of Modern Art and the David Booth Conservation Center and Department. She joined the museum as a conservator in 2013. At MoMA, Lewis directs all aspects of conservation, including collection care, treatment, display, and scientific research. She has been instrumental, absolutely instrumental, in expanding best practices for the acquisition, documentation, and storage of media works, and she oversaw the implementation of the new digital repository. She currently leads a major initiative funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to address issues surrounding the long-term preservation of media-based works. Additionally, Lewis participates in a number of international projects focused on education and advocacy. including the Tech Focus workshop series organized by the American Institute of Conservation's Electronic Media Group, providing detailed technical education in media art. She also serves on the board of Voices in Contemporary Art, VOCA, a non-for-profit organization addressing the production, presentation, and preservation of contemporary art through the dialogue with artists. Prior to her appointment at MoMA from 2005 to 2013, Lewis was a time-based media conservator at the Tate in London. She received a BA in 1994 in art history from the Courtauld Institute of Art and an MA in 1997 in conservation at the University of Northumbria in Newcastle. So please join me in welcoming Kate Lewis presenting a lecture on the subject, Building a Biography.
Well, that was quite a biography. Hello, welcome back for lunch. Thank you so much to the Art Institute for inviting me to talk today. It's a real honor. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Jill. I'm just going to set my timer. Building a biography. Let me get the clicker. So I'm going to start with Martin Creed. Could you hit play, please?
Yeah. Hello, my name is Martin Creed, and I made The Lights Going On and Off. It's work number 227. I see art galleries or museums as being theatres for art, and I see the experience of viewing as a live theatrical experience, and that goes for looking at a painting as much as, you know, experiencing like a room installation. The piece The Lights Going On and Off is a real attempt to try to engage with the theatrical situation which is all around you. I mean, it's almost exactly like a piece of music. It exists as a score or an instruction, and the piece, like a piece of music.
Great, thank you. So this is a great example of an immaterial object. An immaterial work, gosh. The lights do not matter. The room size, the shape of the room do not matter. What matters are the instructions. So we're going to come back to some of those themes this morning. And the instructions are empty room. The lights go on for 5 seconds. The lights go off for 5 seconds. Repeat. I think Martin's thoughts are a nice way to start thinking about how we collect and preserve these works. He emphasizes the theatrical experience of viewing, not only for a room installation, but that also goes for looking at a painting, which we talked about this morning. He says the piece needs to be played or made in order to be experienced, which is of course true for any time-based work, installation-based art, performance art, all of which are beyond the static object, inherently dynamic, and only truly exist when displayed. So I'm going to focus over the next 20 minutes on the idea of building artwork biographies as a tool to support conservation and therefore the ongoing exhibition of these works. A biography that incorporates history, technical documentation, but also one that captures decision-making. It's reflective, and it includes multiple viewpoints and experiences. In contemporary art conservation, we talk about the lives of works, recognizing they have different iterations. And so this idea of life, so why not write a biography about that life? And I'm going to explore this through 2 case studies. The first is a work by the artist David Lamelas, titled The Office of Information about the Vietnam War at 3 levels, the visual, image, text, audio, and it's from 1968. The piece was conceived and first exhibited at the 34th Venice Biennial, where David represented Argentina. The work was then acquired by MoMA in 2012, and we restaged it in 2015, 47 years later. The 1968 installation, which you can see here, comprised of an office with a desk, a chair, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, an assistant, which you can't see, and an operational telex machine which printed the live feed relating to the Vietnam War, which was received from the Italian news agency ANSA. The assistant affixed the telex papers to the wall and then read aloud the updates reporting on the Vietnam War and read them in 4 languages: Italian, French, Spanish, and English. The office was physically separated from the public by a glass wall, and visitors could listen to the performer through those funny little telephone receivers that you can see mounted to the glass exterior. The live readings were also recorded with the reel-to-reel tape deck, so that when the performer was not present, they could still be heard by the public via these phones. Commentaries on this piece have viewed the work as a critique of war reporting and news in general, as received through official channels and mass communication. But Lamela said of his work, "I didn't want to make art that was political. I chose the topic because it was the most important information at the time. I didn't want to make something against the Vietnam War. It would not have been my choice to be a critic of the political system at that moment. It was the information itself that interested me." We'll come back to that. So when this work was gifted to MoMA, the artist provided MoMA with this photograph, which is the official photograph from the Venice Biennial. None of the office furniture existed or was saved. And so what David did is he told me he had this really good friend who was like excellent with eBay. So what they did together was they found a variety of chairs and tables that kind of were period, kind of matched the picture, and then bought them on eBay, and the eBay sellers shipped them directly to MoMA. Later in an interview, David mentioned that this moment of acquisition with the eBay assortment was really just about getting the project started again. So the approach to restaging this work at MoMA was multi-departmental, including curatorial, conservation, and our broad exhibition team. The early phase was led by Martin Hartung, a then curatorial assistant at MoMA, who had a research grant, and he focused on locating original documentation, which was key to this idea of restaging the 1968 piece. He visited the Olivetti archive, and he also went to ANSA, where eventually he was able to track down original telex transmissions about the Vietnam War during the dates on which the work was on show. And without these, we wouldn't have had the text. The text is in the title. So that was really critical. Martin also contacted the archive of Ugo Mulas, an Italian photographer who David had briefly met during the biennial and who was known, he actually photographed every biennial from 54 to 72. So in his research, Martin contacted him and he unearthed, well, his archive, his family archive unearthed, need to change the slide, unearthed this photograph and actually kind of a couple of these, of actually the office in action. David himself had actually never seen these photographs, only ever the official one. So during an interview looking at these photographs, David said 2 interesting things. First, that the official image was somehow dead, but the Ugo Mulas images show the office assistant and the audience listening to the news, and therefore this shows the work as alive. This is another one. Secondly, these images prompted him to talk about the office assistants and the importance of transferring the information to the viewers and the viewers receiving the information, which affirmed the title and the fundamental concept of this work. In conservation, we might refer to this as a work-defining property, so an element which is key to the identity of the work that needs to be preserved. This importance of the live element of transmission and its 3 stages was also reinforced when we found this document among his papers at the Getty Archive. And you can really see that kind of the ziggy-zag lines of liveness. Finding these original documents and looking at them with David during our series of oral interviews really opened up exploring the more immaterial aspects with him, and then hence exploring the sort of fundamental identity of the work. So this is the work restaged at MoMA in 2015 in the exhibition Transmissions, Art in Eastern Europe and Latin America 1960 to 1980, showing the office assistant who is reading the original telex transmissions from 68 and verbally transferring them in 4 languages as before, and we see the audience receiving that information. The act of installing is crucial to these types of works coming into collections, as Francesca will discuss further and we touched on it this morning. But suffice to say, it's the only way as an institution you can really begin to learn these works. But even with all the careful work that was carried out by the team on all the different aspects, down to the refabrication of the Olivetti furniture because we couldn't source it, and finding a very similar telex machine model, which we found in a garage an hour out of Venice, we still missed something. As we were at this point in the image here, David said, "Where are the photographs?" And we went, "What photographs?" And he said, "Well, the photographs on the table, the ones that are the image in the title." During 3 years of acquisition, planning this exhibition, this had not come up in any of our discussions. And we had assumed that the papers on the table were the telex printouts, and that the image referred to looking at the office through the glass. So very quickly, with the help of Sarah Meister, one of our photo curators at MoMA, we found a series of 1968 images of the Vietnam War that could be printed, from which David made a selection, and then he positioned them on the table. It's really impossible to capture absolutely everything. So our biography company, currently encompasses different streams produced collaboratively by the team, tracing the history of the work prior to 2012, how we went about the restaging, that whole process, practical aspects like the dimensions and the building of the office, sourcing visual props, refabricating furniture, and all of this documentation took the form of still, audio, video. We also interviewed our performer, Patricia, at the close of the exhibition, talking about questions like why she was interested in this performance, how David actually directed her and trained her. We also talked about her experience actually in the gallery performing the work, and talked about things like whether she had any tips for future performers. But really at the heart of this documentation is the series of interviews that we did with David, both prior and post to installing the work. So going back to the lives of an artwork and the notion of them allowing to flourish, a term used in 2015 by Pip Lawrenson, conservator and head of collection care research at the Tate. Something struck me after going through this entire process, a persistent theme for David reaching back to the 1960s, which he repeated during these interviews, that the work must be alive and always develop, with 1968 being the first and 2015 being the second point in the life of this piece. He said, "Of course, it's very different to see the work then and now, but when she, the assistant, is there in the gallery at MoMA, the work is alive, it's the present." He also said that the staging in some ways freezes the work, going on to say that another possibility would be to use the elements of today's technology and use a war of today, or if you're in 2054, acknowledging this kind of like moment, if there's no war in 2054, then you could use a film festival or a fashion show, just the most important information at the time. If it's done today, you just need a desk, a laptop, and you read the news to the people from whatever is the fastest source of news. All you need is the concept, the live transmission of the information. What David kept coming back to is that ultimately it's the concept which remains central to him. So the work, the biography, captures all these different kind of ways of looking at this work and what potential future iterations could look like. The second work I'd like to talk about is a piece by the Cuban artist Tania Bruguera, entitled Havana 2000, from 2000, that investigates the impact of state power. It was initially conceived for the 7th Havana Biennial in 2000, where the work was presented in the Cabana Fortress, a military bunker used as a jail for prisoners of conscience during the Cuban Revolution. Bruguera combined this cavernous tunnel-like structure in this fortress with milled sugarcane that you can see on the ground, video footage of Fidel Castro on a monitor, flanked by 4 unclothed standing men who stoically enact a series of gestures from bowing to obsessively brushing their skin in near-total darkness. This is not near-total darkness. In 2000, the work was on view just for a few hours before being shut down by the Cuban government. So post-2000, the piece was reconstructed at the Neuberger Museum of Art at SUNY Purchase in 2010, and then again at the Venice Biennial in 2013. MoMA acquired the piece in 2015, and we restaged it at the Museum of Modern Art earlier this year. At acquisition, we received images of the original installation, a set of display guidelines conveying the artist's priorities for future reconstructions based on previous experiences, a video file, a still from which you can see here on screen, and a consumer 1990s cathode ray tube TV monitor. The acquisition naturally involved a range of conversations with Tania, and a multi-department team came together to pull research from all different angles: curatorial, conservators, conservation scientists, performance producers, exhibition and design, our imaging department, videographers, AV, visitor services, and security, and I'm sure I've left somebody out. So together, we began to write the biography for this work, both deciphering what information could be streamlined into sort of quantifiable instructions for future iterations, and undertaking comprehensive documentation, including video documentation of rehearsals and interviews with the performers after the work came off view, to capture the unfixed and the more subjective aspects which are so critical to this work. So of the many chapters to write was the complex task of achieving a space with similar dimensions, approximately 120 feet long, and a curved roof structure mimicking the military bunker in the original fortress. This was undertaken by one of our exhibition designers called Matthew Cox. And here you can see the curved roof. It's a bit blurry because it's from a GoPro. Here you can see the curved roof beginning to take shape during the construction in the gallery. Matthew, multi-talented, also dealt with the sourcing of the sugarcane bagasse. Modern-day methods of milling sugarcane creates a very different texture and feel to traditional hand processing. Matthew is now an expert in traditional methods of sugarcane production, and he found a group of men in Florida who still use these traditional manual methods, and they grind it once every year. Layered into this was also the question of how to safely bring sugarcane into the museum, which was researched and tested by one of our sculpture conservators, Ellen Moody, and our conservation scientist, Chris McGlinchey, because we really don't want mold and pests, and sugarcane is just perfect for all of that. The uneven feel beneath your feet and its smell adds a strong dimension to experiencing the work, as also is its symbolic significance to Cuba. So this is it here in 2018. Documentation of the restaging was in all of our minds, and an involved series of meetings with the core team worked out how could we sympathetically capture the experience through both still moving image and sound recordings. The darkness, of course, is a critical challenge for camera equipment. Our photographers did quite a good job. They still had to introduce a little bit of light here so we could kind of capture something. And our videographers tested lots of different cameras, originally thinking that we wouldn't be able to capture much, but actually it was quite surprising what we did manage to capture. So we had one of our videographers, basically, you queued, you went round the corner, you went in. There was only allowed to be 4 people in the space at the time. And then basically this was about, I think it was about 80 feet long. And then the videographer basically sort of took the journey that anybody would take as they enter the space, going all the way to the back and walking back again to the front. So we managed to capture the sound of the feet on the sugarcane, as well as some of the quiet physical movements of the performers. None of this replaces the experience of the work, but it was widely agreed by the team to really try and put effort into building sort of the best, most robust documentation that we could. Capturing the smell is a really tricky one, so if anybody has suggestions, I'd love to hear them. So this is as you're walking out of the space. So that's the doorway that you can see. Recording the entire process of working with the performers was central to our biography and ran the gamut of recording the training, rehearsals, debriefs, and at the close of the exhibition, we invited them all to record their experiences through interviews. Critical to casting was to honor one of Tanya's defining elements, that the performers be Cuban or of Cuban descent. The curatorial performance team put together a huge, sort of very impressive schedule that included sessions with the performers when they came into the museum, talking to all the different teams that were involved to hear about all the different aspects of how everybody was approaching this. They also got packets of readings and research about the work and the political climate and its original context. And of course, they spent significant time training and talking with Tanya. So we also kept written notes. They had debrief sessions that continued throughout the entire performance, so we also kept notes of those. So in total, the cast performed for 36 days. That's 257 hours. This shot is one of the rehearsals with Tanya and one of our incredible performers. Shortly after the exhibition closed, we interviewed each performer about their experience, not only as an act of preservation, but also as this work originated under very specific physical conditions and socio-political circumstances. We know that fundamental questions and adaptations will inevitably be raised each time this work is reconstructed. Our biography writing is still ongoing, and we are now embarking on a series of interviews capturing different personal experiences of the work, especially of some of our Cuban visitors. The entire process of collecting and showing all adds to understanding what performance means after its original iteration. So the idea of building biographies of artworks is an evolution and broadening of documentation, which has always been fundamental to conservation. This collaborative biographical approach continues the idea cited in the literature around contemporary art conservation being a social process, a preservation approach previously adopted by ethnographic collections in heritage sites. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. We are going to take questions at the end of this session, so there will be a panel, and please keep your questions until then. So we're going to continue with Annie Fletcher, who will present to us the matter of collection. Annie Fletcher is chief curator at the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. She's also a tutor at the De Appel Amsterdam, the Dutch Art Institute Arnhem, and the Design Academy Eindhoven. She's currently working on the first museum's retrospective of the Otolip Group, which is due in 2019. She recently worked on trade markings in the edition number 5, Frontier Imaginaries, the museum's retrospective of, I hope I pronounce this right, Qui Sai, Journeys Without Arrivals, and the artistic houses becoming more. Other projects include El Lisiski, the Artist and the State at the Irish Museum of Modern Art in Dublin, and the Republic of Art at the Van Abbe Museum in 2015-2016. She was lead contributor from the Van Abbe Museum to the Museum as Hub conference led by the New Museum in New York from 2006 to 2014, and is part of an ongoing collaborative team that developed the Museum of Art Utile with Tanya Bugera in 2013. She curated After the Future at EFA International, Ireland's Biennale of Contemporary Art in 2012, and was co-founder and co-director of the curatorial platform If I Can't Dance, I Don't Want to Be Part of Your Revolution, with Frederik Bergholz and Tanja Elskist. She has contributed to magazines, various magazines and publications. Please join me in welcoming Annie.
Thank you so much, Jill. Lovely introduction. I just want to say, well, I want to say many things, but I want to say, coming from the Netherlands, there are two people we miss, and we appreciate it so much in terms of what they've done for the scene in the Netherlands and just generally in terms of their important practices, and that's Anne Goldstein and Hendrik Volkart. So I'm so happy to be here and to be able to reconnect with these really important protagonists within our work. So yeah, let's hope life is long and more contacts should continue. Thank you so much. It's awesome already that we've been talking about Tanja Bruguera. I mean, she's going to be such a wonderful sort of provocation for all of these discussions. And I think I will also really talk and think about this in relation to her ideas about use and leveraging the museum as a kind of space. So I'm excited that she's already been introduced today. So yeah, I'm somebody who's the chief curator of a museum that's very small. It's quite provincial. It's based in the Netherlands, and it sort of, its smallness and its provinciality allows us to experiment on lots of levels. We feel like we have quite a robust collection, quite a robust team, and we constantly are trying to think, what is the Museum of the 21st Century? How is it that we need to connect as a civic organization, because we are still maybe in the last throes of social democracy, but we are still a civic organization. And we have a collection that belongs to the public. And it's a challenge, and it's an interesting question. How would we continue to collect? How would we think about not only what we might collect in the future, but also how we might work with what we have already? Could this be a sort of corpus or a body of discourse that we might read not only in its intentionality as artists meant it, which you spoke so beautifully about, but also in other ways? Could we leverage it? Could we use it? Could we think it through in many other ways? So I'm going to maybe just talk about some examples of that in our museum. And the first thing I kind of wanted to sort of work with or think about was Karen Barat. So I was excited to hear about this conference on materiality, and I've just started to think about her work because she's been so interesting and exciting on thinking about this idea of what matter means now. So I'd just like to quote her very quickly, and then we'll go into some kind of examples. So she says, "Language has been granted too much power. The linguistic turn, the semiotic turn, the interpretive turn, the cultural turn. It seems that at every turn lately, everything, even materiality, is turned into a matter of language or some other form of cultural representation. The ubiquitous puns on matter do not, alas, mark a sort of rethinking of the key concepts like materiality and signification and the relationship between them. Rather, it seems to be symptomatic of the extent to which matters of fact, so to speak, have been replaced with matters of signification. Language matters. Discourse matters. Culture matters. There is an important sense in which the only thing that does not seem to matter anymore is matter." And her endlessly kind of profound question at the end of all that is, how did language become more trustworthy than matter? Later in her whole project, she tries to think about the dynamic force of matter, that we are matter, that maybe we interact with matter in this kind of very extraordinary performative way. And I think that's a super exciting thing to think about as a museum, So we're not only thinking about these ideas of discrete objects or intentional works that can be historicized or managed, but actually that there's a kind of dynamic force to this relationship. And that's exciting. I think that's really exciting because we need to define what the museum might be right now. And one of the things that we might have in our hands is actually the idea that we are a space in which bodies are in architecture. You know, we have this intense digitization of the world. We have this incredible access to visual information. There are ways in which we could probably negotiate and incorporate and understand visual projects, but actually the space of the museum and the physical interaction and this idea of us with matter is the one thing we might have to offer. It's quite exciting. So for us in the museum, I think this is a shift, perhaps, from the very cerebral understanding, perhaps always of the representationality that she talks about, to rather the idea that the body of work could be dynamic, could be interactive, could be performative. So one of the things she just says about the idea of matter or materiality that I think is quite exciting and that I'd like to hold in our minds as I go through some projects, she says, matter is substance in an interactive becoming. It's not a thing, but it's a doing. It's a congealing of agency. Matter is a stabilizing and a destabilizing process of interactive intraactivity. So perhaps we need to think about the engagement of the museum as something very potentially exciting on that level. If we really understand bodies of discourse, bodies, materiality as something much more dynamic, then maybe this is the space that we can kind of condition those kind of possibilities in a very, very new way. Okay, I'm going to try and use this clicker, I guess. Okay, so I wanted to talk about that in relation to many projects that we've developed in the museum, especially thinking about this idea of our collection. So we have a wonderful collection. It's not huge. It's certainly not as expansive as many of the amazing museums that might represent themselves here today. We have about 3,500 works. But the Vanaba has been an amazing sort of space on the axis of a kind of maybe a really interesting sort of traffic route in relation to modern art within the 20th century, linked to Cologne, to Paris, to Antwerp, to Brussels, and to Amsterdam. So throughout that sort of history, it's been a place that has been attuned to a lot of the traffic, a lot of the possibilities of what art was and what it was being spoken about within Europe at that moment. And so it has a great collection. And one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot is how do we think this now for the 21st century? How do we think about its possibilities, as we said, in relation to this idea of its performative possibility in relation to its matter? And so I would like to introduce a series of the projects that have kind of really troubled that, or at least tried to provoke some other questions rather than just the fidelity towards the work itself, which is completely valid and completely important, but it's also really interesting to think about the idea that you have this resource, you have this body of work. How could one think it differently? And I think that's kind of what we've been trying to push on some levels. And I would really say, in relation to that idea of fidelity and intentionality in relation to artists, that most of these suggestions, which have pushed us into thinking this way, have been from artists. And that's also a kind of interesting permission. It's also an interesting interrogation and an interesting radicality. So this is a work by Superflex. It's called Free Soloist. The amazing Superflex decided that they needed to liberate our soloist sculpture. They set up a factory in a big exhibition which also looked at all of the artworks in our collection of that period, which they called Between Minimalisms. but they set up a factory to reproduce Solowit's work, suggesting, of course, lots of interesting things in relation to the idea of it being industrially produced, not handmade, all of the ideas of what the notion of the discrete object and the sort of fetishized, market-led issues around particular artistic objects might be, especially when artists are trying to trouble that. And so they negotiated very long and hard with Solowit's estate, but also really tried to think about this idea of what it would be to simply think its reproduction given its legacy and its history. So not only did we have this active factory, but in the previous image, we also decided to have a lottery, so people could simply apply to own the Solowit, and 15 people got chosen. And so they came, arrived with their cars and their vans and their whatever, and took this Solowit home. And it was amazing. I mean, it was also really funny because it's a huge thing, you know, and people often underestimated the size of it. So it was also really interesting to see how people had to negotiate the moment of taking this home. So lots of interesting ideas around the idea of ownership, around the idea of democratizing artwork, but also the intentionality of Solowit originally and what he might think about these kind of instructions being taken to another level. So this was the show in between minimalisms that we sort of put up at the same time. The other thing I wanted to talk about in relation to this idea of matter is simply the mass of what a collection is, right? So you have a collection. We've had this really interesting debate around the idea of what we call the museum index, which is to simply read the collection as a thing, as a phenomenon, not as individual things, but actually what do the facts tell? And one of the things that the facts tell, as you can see from this image maybe, which is from an amazing sort of informatics designer called Jos Grotens, is that we apparently buy way more men than anybody else in our collection. As you can see here, this line which goes past the door and all the way to the end is all the men in the Van Abbe's collection. And I suspect they're all white men. I'm not sure, maybe there's one or two others, but that's literally a statistic. So we've done this kind of analysis of the mass of the project as a way to really start to analyze what is, in our hands, what is the repository if you think about it as another body of knowledge. Another way in which we attempted to really think about this idea of what the collection might mean and how one might access it. And again, I'm interested in this idea of fidelity, what we are doing, what our efforts are in terms of actually just trying to produce an experience with an artwork, a pure experience with an artwork in a white cube. We argued against that at one moment. We suggested that perhaps if you chose a different position, then your experience of the same artwork might be different. So we made this huge project which really sort of showed a lot of the works in the Van Abbe Museum's collection, classic, beautiful pieces from Richard Long, from Joseph Beuys, from Bruce Nauman, Ed Ruscha. I mean, we literally unloaded it all through the museum, but we thought about the idea that maybe the experience could be different if you chose to be a flaneur or a tourist or a pilgrim. So a flaneur was somebody who was in this state of distraction. They had earphones, they had this sort of newly composed piece of music. They were perhaps what a flaneur was always supposed to be, sort of a master of the universe, a person who could simply range the world and decide on how they might interpret something. They also were given a notebook where they could take their notes. They could sort of absorb and think through their own way of negotiating the world and interpreting it. The tourist was actually the most fun, I think. It was an incredibly interesting map of all of the facts and interesting anecdotes and highlights that we would like to share with as maybe curators with the public. And The Pilgrim was, in fact, so much information for all of us art nerds out there, you know, endless archival material, wonderful sort of deep readings of work, perhaps the interviews with artists, a really in-depth position which might actually allow one to kind of engage at a different level with the practice. Another thing we looked at was geography. We simply state that we're an international museum that collects artworks. What does international mean? It clearly showed with all of these dark patches on the map that we were a very eclectic international museum. We collected mainly from the States, from Germany, from the Netherlands, from Britain, partly Russia, because we were collecting a lot of Lissitzky. But there's huge gaps. So this kind of encyclopedic effort that museums just seem to think that they have were things that we wanted to simply read and challenge in relation to what we had bought. Another thing was value, simply the idea that, you know, there is a reason why we are so focused on the materiality of objects, the antithesis perhaps to Karen Barad, which is market, which is money. So this whole informatic scheme shows how the price of all of those artworks that we may have bought right from 1936, when the museum started, until now, have risen exponentially and incredibly. So it's an interesting way to think the material. It's an interesting way to sort of analyze what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. Another thing that we tried to look at one point, we have an incredible collection, Kandinsky obviously part of it, with slightly doubtful provenance. We have an issue around the Second World War and certain works that we are simply not sure where they came from and how they were purchased. And so we did a big project trying to expose this, trying to talk about this. And this was something that we spent a lot of time thinking with our mediators and with many people about how would we discuss this. So these are suddenly, you know, these are mediation heavy, different ways of encountering the collections. And I think they're super valuable and super interesting, and they're something that we all learn from on so many levels. And this is another kind of, I was thinking about the idea of the performative, and this is the museum being performative. In fact, it's an index, it's a kind of continuation of that index that we showed earlier, but actually it has, it changes. So every 2 weeks, the registrar, this wonderful woman, Marcia, comes and changes the arrows here, suggesting what's on loan, what's not on loan, what's on show, and also thinks about the value of the works. So the red-colored works are the highest value, and these are questions that visitors are quite interested in. I mean, these are simply emerging because this is what we hear from our public. You know, they're interested in what it is. You know, if you really think about the idea that you maybe show 10% of your collection, the rest of it sits in the depot, how do you activate this? How do you think about this repository of extraordinary cultural and artistic objects and how they might be, received or engaged with by the public all the time? So this is another experiment that we've developed. You can see, there's something important about it too, I think, in relation to the body and in relation to just walking into the space and not just reading it online, actually seeing it in relation to artworks, coming and physically thinking, okay, this is what I can see and this is what I can't see. Okay, and the last project I think I wanted to talk about is indeed from an amazing, amazing artist called Limu, who again challenged us, like Superflex did, and said, I want to borrow works from your collection and I want to bring them to my village in China. I want to think about the urban-rural massive transformation, and I want to think about these works that are considered super stable works. They're kind of understood to be important modernist works. So we have, of course, Dan Flavin here. We've got Sol LeWitt, many other artists that he sort of engaged with. So even his decision on who and what he would bring to his village was fascinating. The idea that they might be considered so secure in their status somehow. And that's what he asked us for. So we agreed. So we loaned him the works. And this experience of time, this experience of engagement with works was so radically different than anything we could offer in our architecture. Not only our architecture, also our kind of super European sort of situation. So it was fascinating. It was super important for us also to think about how these works might be disseminated and engaged with elsewhere, and over a totally different time period. So not all were original works. Some were their own attempt to recreate, which is, I think this is so beautiful. Richard Long, Wood Circle. A Sol LeWitt being used or abused, perhaps. An artist called John Cormeling, who's based in the Netherlands, and this very joyful work, Neon Sign, which stayed up for over a year. Sol LeWitt, based on his instructions. This is very hard to see, and I'm sorry, it's a bit of a bad image, but it's Marina Abramovic and Ule in the grocery shop. So extraordinary. And the guy who owned the grocery shop was obsessed and super interested and wanted to figure out everything he could know about Abramovic and Ule, and communicated it. So I'm excited by those possibilities, those ideas of how one might push the collection, think the collection differently, think about what it is, this incredible resource we have, and how we might actually think its matter as a dynamic force. Okay, so very quick last project. And how am I doing for time, Jill? Am I done? I'm okay? Okay. So the last one I want to think about in relation to this is also that. It's to do with ideas of leverage, cultural capital, but also artistic, something that's so artistically amazing. So this is a beautiful, beautiful work that we own. It's a Picasso, La Buste Femme. It's from 1943. And through a series of discussions that we, again, were having with a lot of artists and organizers from mainly the Middle East region, it was a long-term project. It was a lot of discussion. It was people involved from Iran, from Lebanon, from Palestine, from Morocco, from Egypt. And it was a big discussion about how we might think about how they were organizing, what they were doing. And one of the clear things was that they said to us was, we don't necessarily want you just to represent us. We want to think about what this relationship could be. And so that conversation took a while, and it was really interesting. And in the end, one of the manifestations of this long-term engagement was the idea that we sent our Picasso, this wonderful painting, to Palestine. And this took 2 years. It was a kind of an amazing discussion, again, around the idea of what is the professional practice of museums and how can we push them? How can we actually think them differently? What is it that is so sedimented about our practice that becomes kind of ridiculous and stops things or doesn't allow things? And certainly on paper, nothing about this project was allowed. It was sending a very precious painting into a war zone. It was sending it according to sort of insurance values and transportation to a state that doesn't exist. So the negotiation, the effort to kind of produce this project was extraordinary, but all the more interesting. So we looked at Sol LeWitt. That's where we started, with these copies of the work, these sort of flouting of the original. And yet here, the point was the original was so important. It was like a request, a discussion from the art school in Palestine where they said, we will never get to see a Picasso. And so to take that request really seriously is an interesting thing. It's this dynamic idea of what material could be. And our whole museum was like super obsessed with how to maintain and mind this piece. It wasn't an easy discussion internally either. And so eventually it arrived and was built into a kind of museum-like facilities and structure in the Art Museum in Palestine with appropriate security. That's it, I think. So I wanted to go from the idea of the copy to the original. I wanted to sort of think through how we might expand and argue these ideas of the matter and the matter as a dynamic form. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annie, for this very thought-provoking presentation. Our next speaker is Francesca May, and Francesca will talk to us about the Preservation Through Display, the Guggenheim Panzer Collection Initiative. Francesca joined the Salomonar Guggenheim Museum in 2010 as part of the Panzer Collection Initiative, and in this multi-year research project funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation that addresses the long-term preservation and future of the exhibition of minimalist, post-minimalist, and conceptual art that the museum acquired from the Italian collectors Panzer. May came to the Guggenheim from the Dia Art Foundation in New York, where she served from 2006 to 2010 as the organization's very first conservator and initiated a comprehensive program for conservation and collection care. From 2001 to 2006, she worked in a similar capacity as the first conservator at the Genetti Foundation in Marfa in Texas, overseeing the conservation and collection care for the museum's permanent collection and temporary collections. So please join me in welcoming Francesca.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Christina. It's such a pleasure to be here and part of this, the program for today. I feel especially honored to be part of this particular panel with Kate and Annie. Just have loved your talks, and I can't wait to our conversation all together in a little bit. And I also wanted to say it's such a delight to be in a room with natural light. It just makes such a difference. So I really want to say thank you to the Art Institute for making such a beautiful building. As Christina described, I've been at the Guggenheim for about 8 years working on a dedicated research initiative that's focused on a collection of art that the Guggenheim acquired about 25 years ago from Italian collectors Giovanna and Giuseppe Panza. The initiative was devised as a collaboration between the disciplines of conservation and kind of curatorial art historical concerns, and was dedicated to answering some practical questions around works in the Guggenheim collection that were received from Panza that kind of came along with quite a lot of controversy and some baggage about their status and future. That topic is something that kind of belongs in a separate 2-day conference itself, but I can just kind of briefly describe the project focused over the course of about 6 or 7 years with 2 different phases of funding from the Mellon Foundation. First on the 5 artists that you see here on the screen in-depth case studies, and then continued on looking at another group of artists. Let's see, there we go. In the subsequent phase. And as Christina mentioned, it was really about addressing kind of practical concerns, but also looking more broadly to examine some of the philosophical questions of what ownership of these works mean, how to preserve and display them in the future, but along with attempting to resolve some of the kind of thorny controversies that the Panza collection included when it came into the museum's holdings. We recently have been awarded, in fact, a third phase of funding from the Mellon Foundation, which is just so remarkable, purely dedicated to dissemination. So we'll be publishing our archive, hosting a conference in New York in the spring of next year, and having a publication that comes out of the conference proceedings. And I should mention that the project and the artwork that I'm about to talk about, an exhibition, was co-organized, co-curated, co-run with my colleague Jeffrey Weiss, curator and art historian, and he's no longer at the Guggenheim, but has been utterly crucial and central to every part of what I'm talking about today. And this is just a couple slides just to show the Panzas. Giuseppe passed away in 2010, but Giovanna is still living. They had a villa north of Milan in Varese, Italy, which was their home, but also became a site where they displayed a collection that they amassed over the course of about 5 or 6 decades. And they were just remarkable visionary collectors, typically collecting contemporaneously, beginning in the 1950s with kind of emergent art of that period. They never spent more than sort of modest sums on artworks as they were making these acquisitions, often buying directly from artists, from their studios, etc., and almost always developing holdings in each artist with incredible depth and breadth. And one of the other things that they were very involved with was this idea of permanent installation, which of course, beginning in the 1970s, is something that Donald Judd is very involved with, and Heiner Friedrich and Philippa de Menil and the founding of Dia Art Foundation begin to explore this idea of permanently citing works of art on long term. And indeed, the Panzas work directly with many artists to cite works permanently at their home in Varese, and many of these are still on view today. The site is still run by the Italian National Trust, and for instance, James Turrell's first Sky Space is there. There's significant works on view by Robert Irwin and Dan Flavin, so it's really a remarkable place if you're ever in the neighborhood. The rest of my presentation is going to focus on the 2017 realization of a single work from the Panza collection. And I think this sort of 1971 parentheses 2017, it could have been the title of my talk, just because it sort of occupies this moment of thinking about time and what it means in the life of a single work. Doug Wheeler was one of the artists within our second phase of research, and the holdings by Doug include 6 works from the 1960s and 70s, yet as we began our investigation, we saw that 4 of them had never been realized. And for each, there were only single large format drawings, which were somewhat abstract conceptualizations by the artist. We realized this presented an opportunity to work with Doug to produce one of these artworks and to examine and document the process from beginning to end. The work that was selected to realize was PSAD, Synthetic Desert 3, which you see here depicted on the screen, the 2017 realization of it. The work itself was conceived in 1971, and it belonged to a body of work that Doug thought of at that time, nearly 50 years ago, which was to take the form of an anechoic chamber, a space that would suppress all sound. The only thing in the space would have been whatever ambient sound was produced by humans in the space, but for all intents and purposes, it's a completely soundless environment. Doug's conception of this body of work was rooted in his own oral and spatial encounters in desert environments in the southwest of the United States. Although he never had the resources to build works from this group, and therefore it remained an essentially unexplored territory for him, yet one that still possessed a great deal of interest on his part. So we undertook an exhaustive interview process with the artist, and I have to admit at the outset, I think we really reached overkill with the amount of interviews that we conducted, and I can talk about that a little bit more. But we began the very kind of complicated and challenging process of tackling all the practical questions around realizing such a technically complex and resource-heavy work, while at the same time attempting to also be self-critical as we moved through the process to examine what stewardship and posterity even means for works of this kind. And here's the early drawing from 1971. This was our starting point. This was what existed for the work. Just to really emphasize, the work had never been physically manifested before. It solely existed on this sheet of vellum. The work was purchased by Panza in 1971 with the idea that it would be produced at a later date with Doug's participation and guidance. Panza purchased many works in a similar manner, producing myriad gray areas and opportunities for eventual disagreements with artists, which is kind of the meat and potatoes of what we've been looking at for quite a long time at the Guggenheim. But Doug has a very particular and an exquisitely beautiful practice around drawing. And for Doug, he talks about the way in which drawing allows for him, in a way, to kind of realize the space and occupy it almost. He talks about, in a sense, the act of drawing is almost a point of satisfaction that he can reach on his own, and in some cases doesn't feel a need that he needs to actually build the space. And for Doug, and I think several artists of this generation, it wasn't always the case that they would have opportunities to build projects that had, you know, a degree of sort of ambition and required resources. And here's just a closer detail. The drawing describes, of course, some of the key visual and acoustic elements of the work: the anechoic chamber, the pyramidal forms on the floor, the coved junctures between the ceilings and walls, the viewing platform, a neon lighting element that runs along the base of the viewing wall, and the two ramps leading down to entrance points. However, it also leaves out a great deal of detail, and according to Doug, this drawing was not produced to envision the piece in any given space or place. Instead, it solely represents a conceptualized or idealized version of the work. With Doug, we began to further explore the identity of the work and consider how it might be realized at the Guggenheim in the one space that was available and potentially suitable. One of the museum's kind of so-called rectilinear tower galleries that's part of the 1990 addition made to Frank Lloyd Wright's Rotunda. However, some crucial and significant aspects of that gallery space immediately posed potential problems. One being the fact that the plan of that gallery was a quite extended rectangle, and Doug's initial plan for this piece was a square, and also it didn't have enough ceiling height. Here you can just see the ownership statement inscribed along the lower edge of the drawing, and kind of calls Miwan's great conversation this morning about the moment of transfer, and how that at times can be a separate act of the artist, you know, conceiving of the work, but then at moment of transfer, beginning to kind of formulate another layer of information about the piece. It includes a description of central elements of the piece, of course the anechoic chamber above all, neon being the illumination source, and also a range of options for the color of the pyramids. But there's several significant differences between what's depicted and described in the drawing and what we eventually came to construct with Doug at the Guggenheim last year. One is that in this text, he describes timed 15 to 30 minute lighting gradations so that the lights would cycle and change over time. And early on, Doug said that he wanted the lights to be static. But most notably, Doug at the outset described to us sort of soon after conceiving of this body of work in the late 60s, early 70s, that he didn't, in fact, want it rooted in a purely anechoic space. He wanted to create what he was calling a semi-anechoic space, because he realized he didn't want it to be connected to the sensory deprivation. You know, some of the other works of art that were a little bit more taking cues from sensory deprivation and that kind of psychological effect. And along those lines, he, at the very outset of our conversations with him, started to talk about this idea of, along with creating the semi-anechoic chamber, introducing a very subtle sound element to what he described to enliven the space. We were all kind of facing the absolute unknown about whether or not this realization would be successful, and Doug began a process to visualize a version of the piece to fit within the museum's rectilinear gallery. He produced a series of new drawings which related to the dimensions of the available space. simultaneously, because of the configuration and size of the available gallery, we were all attempting to explore what degree of compromise would be acceptable that would still allow the piece to be an authentic realization of the historic work. Ultimately, this was the question we attempted to explore over and over again with Doug, with regard to the shape of the room, but also the materials that were used. Other limitations that Doug suddenly needed to contend with, or at least respond to, because he was citing it within the context of a large public institution, included very noisy HVAC systems that couldn't be turned off, fire suppression systems, freight elevators, load-bearing capacities and limitations of the building, security imperatives, ADA compliance, and very frankly, budget constraints. Each of these things presented hurdles for the construction team and for Doug, and each presented a possible need for a significant compromise to the work. And it even extended to the whole question of visitorship for the piece. When we began the conversation to ask Doug, how many people at a time, and how do you envision this? He said, oh, I know exactly what, one person at a time. And that for us was going to be a very tough sell. And but in dialogue with him, we ended up at establishing 5 people at a time in the space, but it was very much, in play. And this question of, well, what will compromise the experience? Really, ideally, it really should be one person at a time. And a related question was duration. How long should any one person be in the space? And these were things that, these were conversations that went up to and continued beyond the opening date. This is just another version of a drawing Doug produced in the preparation of the construction of the piece. But we cycled back and forth with Doug and the extremely dedicated and talented exhibition designers at the Guggenheim many, many times to figure out how to situate the piece in our building. And Doug really did produce drawing after drawing after drawing to figure this out. And as I said, it's his way of working out all of the aesthetic and spatial considerations by, in a way, occupying the piece in his own mind. Using Doug's drawings, the exhibition designers then created 3D renderings of the space, which Doug said were extremely helpful in allowing him to refine the configuration and proportion of the work, especially things like the height of the platform and the shape and the size of the pyramids. And that's another aspect that shifted from his initial drawing. And it's just interesting to point out, this was a tool that wouldn't have been available to Doug in 1971. So throughout our conversations with him, the question of new technology and how that came to bear on what we realized in 2017 versus 1971 kind of were at play. Beyond the aesthetic and formal questions around whether we could produce this piece, we had to examine whether or not we could even achieve the semi-anechoic chamber quality. And we worked with amazing sound engineers from the firm Arup, Raj Patel and Joseph Diggerness, and they took readings of existing conditions within the museum. The black line represents a rainy Saturday in the Guggenheim, which, if you think of the shape of the Guggenheim, it's like a megaphone, basically. So it can be a very, very noisy space. The faint gray line on this graph is what Doug wanted. He wanted to get down to about 10 decibels, and the green and fuchsia lines are what the engineers felt we could do. But interestingly, in the course of their examinations, they started to pick up sounds that that are normally imperceptible, but once a semi-anechoic environment was established, they knew that, oh, we'll definitely hear that buzzing electrical panel 1 floor above. We'll hear chairs rolling on a concrete floor. We'll hear a hand dryer going off in a nearby bathroom. So the little fuchsia peaks represent those kind of mechanical conditions that the engineers knew we couldn't eliminate by creating a kind of isolation box to build the art space within. And they introduced this idea of adding a low-frequency sound to buffer some of these mechanical noises, and it aligned well with what Doug initially asked to kind of incorporate in his initial idea of the piece, which was a sound element. So this began to be developed, and we had this sort of wild experience of doing video conferencing with Doug, of us in New York and Doug in LA, listening to recordings from the desert And I have to say, it was a moment where we all felt a little bit scared because no one could tell when the recording stopped or started. So I was really feeling like no one is going to get this ever, and Doug must have super hearing. But he created a kind of sound diagram to help us envision and kind of execute his idea for how the space should be, how he wanted to use sound to spatialize the exhibition space. And I'm going to just click through these slides very quickly, just showing you the process of interviewing him and doing various testing for lighting, the actual build out of the space. It was an absolutely monumental effort for the Guggenheim to undertake, and I think really kind of explored the boundaries of what was reasonable and unreasonable for the museum. But everyone was, deeply pleased with kind of where we ended up, and it really was well received. And just in closing, I just wanted to point out, Doug considered the results a success, but it really still leaves questions about how this work will live in time. Also, it was very much not lost on us that since it's likely that this will be the only realization of the piece during Doug's lifetime, and that it has these flaws. It didn't conform with Doug's idealized version of the piece as he drew it. This is now the exhaustively documented version of the piece that will live through time. So we struggle with that as well. And ideally, and people who work in conservation of time-based media know this very well, that ideally in artwork you want to have several, ideally 2 or 3 realizations of a piece to tease out, citing it in different spaces, how the work, what are the defining attributes of the work. I want to say also to the Mellon Foundation that it was just a remarkable kind of visionary funding for them to give to this project, because by no means was it certain that it would be a success for the institution, but also for the Mellon, and it really speaks to the way in which that kind of funding can enable these projects where over time deep research and extensive interviews are made with artists. And I'll just end on a slide showing the 3 other works by Doug that remain unrealized, to highlight that it kind of calls into question, what the future is for works that exist on paper. Thanks.
Thanks to the 3 of you for your wonderful presentations. And I know we're running a little bit tight on time, but I just wanted to ask one more question, which really picks up what you said, what Kate very much mentioned in her presentation as well. And I'm just fascinated with the idea how much the option of having extremely complex installation and their reinstallation being part of an active, proactive museum's policy. I'm thinking of a red flag that is blinking in the collection management system saying, oh, this piece needs to go back onto display because otherwise it's in real harm. Do you think this is something that can happen? You can really, based on your experience, build into your policy?
I mean, it was absolutely what motivated us to include Doug as one of the artists that we applied to the Mellon to do a second phase of research on, because we knew there were these 4 works that had been unrealized, and without having them built, they simply exist in that dimension. And I should point out, there are 42 other works by other artists in that same state. So it's not exclusive to Doug Wheeler, and it's, I'm sure, not exclusive to the Guggenheim. I'm sure there's many other institutions that have works in that similar category, but absolutely it's a risk of loss.
I totally agree. We are opening up to the audience for further questions.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, yes. early on, because of the scale of what it meant to create the installation by Doug, and just because of the budget, it needed to be a public exhibition. There was no way we could do what we needed to do to fully realize the piece and not have it open to the public. So it ended up, you know, the tail ended up, or I guess a tail of the dog ended up wagging something. But, you know, it pushed us over the finish line. I think also we wouldn't have been able to embark on such an ambitious realization had it not been public. And again, there's just no way this would have happened without Mellon funding. So it speaks to resources required for many of these installations. It's not insignificant. It's a huge issue. And, you know, paired with their vulnerability. Of course. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Does the museum have any protocol of, or do you have experience that museums want to vet things first now to know, you know, what the implications are of acquiring, and both in terms of realizing the work expense and longevity? Great question. Yeah, I think you. For us, we're a very small museum, so I think the kind of discussion happens not in sort of super organized, big strategic planning, but rather in quite informal ways, which is great. And I think we kind of try and challenge that, exactly that. If we're trying to vet it, if we're trying to sort of suggest that it's kind of impossible, that's something that we really need to think about, and that's a real dynamic. I mean, right now we're kind of working with a group of people called As Long As It Takes, who are really pushing us on our collection by saying that we're a super white institution and we need to think about other practices. And it's not an easy discussion, and it's sometimes really quite a painful one. So it's whether it's technical or financial or ideological or I don't know, all of these things. I think that's the point, right? What would we decide would be the thing that we would need to represent in the long term as a legacy? So I can't say we have a vetting procedure. We're often scared, but we definitely try and give it a go.
I think that's a great question. I think certainly in my experience, museums are very carefully considering these works before they come into the collection. And I think that we see with this kind of huge undertaking with the Tanya Bruguera piece, it was built in the discussion, I think it was like 2 years of discussion before the piece came in. And then it was very much at that point understood within the museum that we really had to realize that piece relatively quickly after acquiring it. I wouldn't say that's true for all works, but I think that piece particularly begins to push. And I think a lot of these pieces, you were talking about Simone Forte earlier, also coming into MoMA's collections, it's really interesting how these pieces are really beginning to kind of like push the museum. And what does it mean to collect a history of performance? What does it mean to collect performance? They're just like pushing, and as they push, we think and change and adapt in those ways, but it's a challenge.
I think we have the time for one more question.
What kind of, as the museum, let's say acquisitions, is considering a very difficult work, what kind of argument needs to be made for it to get the green light?
To be acquired?
Right. So is it about what are the turning points in which someone could be convinced that, like, you know, we can never make that work, you know, we shouldn't collect that work. But then someone can make the argument in a certain direction to, let's say, convince the naysayer or something like that. Because I was very surprised by what happened with Forti. And perhaps it's really the finesse of the curators, Or is it, are you part of the conservators are obviously part of the conversation now on acquisitions? Is it not true? I'm just wondering what the resistance points are and the point of like the turn of a museum being convinced they could handle it or want to handle it. Is that too
I mean,
specific?
I think I can't answer in concrete terms. There's so many resistant points, and they're all different for the different types of works. And there's a whole range that I could probably list off of what potentially are resistance points. How it finally gets through, ultimately, it's really driven curatorial. So I think it's just a lot of discussions about what it means, working with the artist. Conservation is involved, but we're certainly not, no, you can't acquire this piece. I mean, that's not how our, it's just like, well, okay, what is it? That's the basic conservator question, what is it? You know, there's many, I would say that to bring these pieces in, there's discussions throughout the entire museum, like everybody gets involved, even in a really large institution as well. There's a robust kind of discussion, and maybe that's why it takes so long, and that's maybe that adds to points of resistance.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a great question, but it's also, impossible to answer. But it's that idea of how could you be responsible for the work too, right? Mm-hmm. Could you actually really, on every level represent it properly? Those are the kind of things you're thinking about too. Like, do we have the knowledge? Do we have the possibility? Do we have the facilities? Do we have the everything to actually really, with great fidelity, show this work? And I think that's a beautiful question, and also one that so many conservators take really seriously. They listen to artists and they try to think about that.
I would just add, something like the Panza collection, which was comprised of 350 artworks. Probably around 50 or so were in a category similar to something like Synthetic Desert of, very, ambitious scope to realize and no kind of precedent to look towards. And questions weren't being asked 25 years ago the way we will ask them today. So I think it would be a very different process today than it was 25 years ago.
Thank you. Thanks to our speakers of this session. I'm sure the discussions will continue during the coffee break, which is going to follow. And so the last session will be on the collection as a living archive, which is going to start at 4. And please plan to reconvene here a little earlier to get our session started. Thank you.